I'm standing in front of the Nordic Stave Church in Moorhead, Minnesota. It was built after the model of a Norwegian stave church on the coast of Norway. And this is the perfect setting as we launch into our third episode, which covers the conversion of the Vikings to Christianity. We're going to look at what elements brought about their conversion. We're going to look at some of the key figures who played a role in bringing the gospel to the people in Scandinavia, especially some of the prominent women. And then we're going to also look at the cultural impacts that Christianity had on their civilization. Prior to the 9th century, there was very little evangelistic work that was done in Norway. Those who traveled to the region were either killed or persecuted in some way, and there was very little lasting fruit from their ministries. Many accounts of the evangelistic methods that were used to bring the gospel to the Norse people focused primarily on signs and wonders as they communicated the power and authority of Christ as King. While the seeds of faith are planted in the heart and then stirred into being by the work of the Spirit, there are various methods and modes that are used to bring the knowledge of Christ to a people. And one of those that was used to bring the gospel to the Norse was that of diplomatic evangelism. In 814, Harald Klak, who was king of Jutland, sought help from Louis the Pious, king of the Franks, to reclaim his kingdom. One of the conditions was that he accept Christianity. So he sat down and studied with Louis the Pious and was taught the doctrines and principles of the Christian faith. And upon being stirred by the grace of God, he was baptized and believed, and was aided by Louis the Pious in his conquest to retake his kingdom. And then he was able to bring in missionaries to proclaim the gospel in his region. Then in 827, a missionary was invited by King Bjorn to come to his kingdom and teach his people about the message of Christianity. And he was able to establish a small group and community of believers who were faithful to Christ. And in that period, that is one of the primary methods that God used to bring his gospel, was by the invitation of kings and rulers to bring missionaries in to evangelize and to then communicate to the people the glorious deeds of Christ and to bring about their sanctification. Mother and son relationships, as well as wives and husband relationships, were also a powerful means by which the gospel was brought in to Norway and to the other Scandinavian countries. In Denmark, Gorm the Old, who was the king, he was a persecutor of the Christians until his wife was able to convince him to allow the missionaries to come and serve, because they didn't have a message that was contrary to mercy and peace. So she was able to convince him to let the missionaries in under that pretense. And then she was also able to influence her son, Harald Bluetooth, to continue that when he became king. So around 960, Harald Bluetooth was king of Denmark, and he was in battle with Otto I. And Otto I, who was king of the Holy Roman Empire, he defeated Harald in battle. And one of the conditions of surrender was that Harald allow more missionaries to enter into Denmark and to make a concerted effort in evangelizing the people among the Danes. So Harald acquiesced to that term of surrender, allowed missionaries in, and then he himself wanted to see what their faith was made of. So he invited a missionary named Papa to come, and Papa presented the gospel to him, but Harald wanted to see before he believed. So he told Papa that he wanted to see him demonstrate his faith, that the faith of the Christian was more superior to that of the Nordic gods. And so Papa took a heavy weight of iron that was heated, he hoisted it up in his arms and carried it for a distance without burning himself. And because of this, Harald believed in the power of Christ, repented, and began becoming an emissary himself to bring in more missionaries and evangelize his people. The epitaph on his stone says that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. It was in 865 that the great army of the Danes and Norwegians invaded the people on the British Isles. And this giant army invaded in East Anglia, and they marched over all of the island, conquering many of the kingdoms until they got to Wessex. And King Hallfred defeated them. And then one of the terms of surrender there was that they remain in a portion of the island. And Guthrum, who had seen that the power of Christian God was better and more stronger than his Norse gods because they had been defeated, surrendered himself to Christ and to be baptized. And Guthrum lived as a Christian king in the Danelaw until he died. The Danelaw was that area which was reserved for the Danes to live in England, and that became a permanent settlement of theirs, which then eventually became Christian through evangelistic methods by the Angles and the Christians in England. And so we see that the way that God used rulers and people in authority to bring into their realm others to promote and preach the gospel of Jesus and to bring the good news of salvation to them. And that throughout this region of history, in this period, we see that that was the primary method that God used as an instrument to bring about the conversion of a people to the knowledge of his Son, Jesus Christ. So we see that rulers had a significant influence over the conversion of their subjects, but it wasn't by royal fiat that they did it. It's not that the king said, be Christian, and they all became Christian, but it was a group think mentality. It was a culture where, by and large, the people made decisions together. It wasn't an individualistic culture, and so the decision to follow Jesus was made collectively. And this group decision-making process is inherent to many tribal cultures. This was the primary method of conversion for the Germans, Danes, Norse, and Icelanders. And so, church missionaries to the Vikings placed a heavy emphasis on the victory of Christ and less on Jesus as a suffering servant, and I found that to be an interesting way in which they contextualized the gospel to reach the people in the north.
Alright, by the late 900s, Norway had been exposed to Christianity, but many of their pagan idolatrous traditions continued. It's about this time that one of the most infamous of all Vikings comes into play, Olaf Tryggvason. His story sounds similar to a chapter from the Book of Kings. His father was a petty king in Norway, and he was killed when he was an infant, and this forced him to flee with his mother. She attempted to get him to Russia, but she was discovered by spies of the new king, and she was killed. So he was sold into slavery. He lived there as a slave till he was about 11, and a Russian actually saw him and recognized him and bought him, redeemed him essentially, so he was free now, and brought him back to Russia. He must have been, we know he was a huge man with exceptional strength, so he must have really stood out, and the Russians gave him, when he was still in his teens, gave him a small fleet of ships and set him up as a Viking, and his Viking career began. He was extraordinarily cruel, and he was very effective as a plundering Viking, I'll put it that way. He was cunning, and he was a skilled navigator. And between him, he went around Europe, Northern Europe and the Northern Seas with his buddy Svein Forkbeard, and they wreaked havoc everywhere they went. And so he comes to England in 991, and he wins a bunch of battles there. There's a famous battle that the English are proud of because one of their heroes gets really close to defeating Olaf and Svein, but they're Ole and Svein. I just realized that. Yeah, anyways. Bertnath is a great English hero. His story is great too. There's a poem written about him. But So Olaf and his followers and Svein go around England, and they're just pillaging the land and killing people, and it's really terrible. And they force the British king Ethelred to pay a heavy ransom, lots of silver, and that temporarily satisfies him. But right before he leaves and goes back to Norway, he hears about a hermit who possesses the gift of prophecy, and he says, okay, I gotta go check this out. So he goes to the hermit, and he doesn't actually go himself. He knows that he sort of has an imposing presence, so he dresses up his biggest warrior in royal clothes and sends him to the hermit. And the hermit sees through it right away and says, you're not the king. He says, but you should respect the king. Olaf was intrigued and was impressed that the hermit knew it wasn't the king. So he says, I have to see the hermit for myself. So he goes to the hermit, and his goal is to see if the hermit can predict his future. So he wants to know, is he going to be successful? Is he going to be famous? The hermit says, thou will become a renowned king and do celebrated deeds. And that thou not doubt the truth of this answer, listen to this. And then he predicted a very specific series of events. Olaf would soon suffer a mutiny on his ship, and in the fight he would be wounded, and he'd be carried to his ship on an oblong shield, and in 7 days he would be healed, and he would come back and see the hermit. So Olaf goes back to his ship, and exactly what the hermit said would happen happened. There was a mutiny, he was wounded, he was carried on his oblong shield. 7 days later he runs back to the hermit and says, how did you know this would happen? And the hermit says, well, the God of the Christians has blessed me, and he gives me wisdom to know what will happen. And Olaf decides to become baptized as a Christian. So he spends a year in Britain contemplating his new faith, and he remembers Norway, his homeland, the nation of his birth, and he realizes that Christianity comes with dignity and honor and respect for life, and he wants that for Norway. And so he decides to go back to Norway. And he's coming back to Norway as a powerful king. So everybody knows when he's coming that whatever religion he has adopted is now going to hold sway in Norway, just as Curtis described earlier. So one of the most significant pieces of Scandinavian culture that I think we are unfamiliar with is the role of bards or skalds or poets in their courts. These were essentially the historians of their time. They took a lot of creative license. They wove in stories of the pagan gods, but they were recording events, battles, things that were happening during that time. Olaf really wanted the services of a bard named Hallfred. Now, Hallfred was not a Christian, and as I mentioned, as a bard, he used the pagan pantheon in all his writings. So converting to Christianity to him would be a literary disaster. He wouldn't be able to use the same material in his poems. So he hears Olaf is coming, and he gets into a boat, and he tries to escape. A huge gale sweeps him right back into the harbor, and he falls out of his boat. His boat falls to pieces, and a huge cloaked figure appears out of nowhere, dives in the water, pulls him out, and saves him. And imagine his embarrassment when he discovers it's Olaf Tryggvason, the very man he was trying to escape. The king is rescuing him. And Olaf says, price for your rescue, reject your pagan idols, and become a Christian. And Hallfred says, okay. I think at that point he realizes he doesn't have any other options. So he says, okay, but you be my godfather. And this was essentially him hoping that he wouldn't end up dead, because the godfather was supposed to protect his god's son. So Hallfred reluctantly accepts Christianity and becomes his bard. And this is just an example of some of Olaf's method of converting people. He was notably forceful in his evangelistic efforts. There was definitely some error involved. But I just want to quick read some of Hallfred's poems, because they're somewhat humorous, and also I think helpful in understanding the culture. So Olaf tells him to write a poem about Christianity coming to Norway. So Hallfred starts, "Time was I worshipped him who well skilled governs Valhalla. Lo, there is a shocking shift. Men's ways are other these days." So he's referring to Christianity as a shocking shift, and the king says, "Nope, not good enough." So then he tries again. "To praise thy power, Odin, poets have ever made sacred songs. For me it is pleasant to remember. Reluctant I was to despise the spouse of Frigg, since Christ alone now must I serve." And Olaf still sees through it and says, "You think too much about the gods. You have to change your subject matter." So the king's being very patient, and Hallfred kind of thinks he's just going to die because he's not doing what the king says. But the king is being patient and says, "Nope, try again." So Hallfred tries again, and he says, "I am finished with the raven god, who is honored by all, whose guile was acclaimed by all nations." And the king says, Stop right there. That's not any better." And he gives him some time, and he says, "Come back." So Hallfred goes back, and he does some research on Christianity and the Christian God, and he has some new material. And here's his poem that finally satisfies the king. "Let fiends find Hoodman's favor, though Freya be angry, and Freya and Thor the mighty. I recant the errors of the witches outright, to Christ with all faith henceforth, fearful of his anger, who under the world Father wields wide sway, and to God I will pray." And the king is finally satisfied. He says, "Another." So Hallfred writes, "Rites of blood are banned. In Olaf's house all must shun the witches' right. All forsake the rude cross. I, sprung from the witches' issue, now worship only Christ." So Olaf's strategy is mostly become a Christian or die. But that is very much a part of him wielding sway as a civil authority and the culture of their time. And we're going to talk about that more later. So it's important not to just it would certainly not be correct in our day and time, and mostly wasn't correct in his day and time, but there was an aspect of it that was important to the way their culture worked at the time. And after this time, after Olaf goes around, he systematically goes through Norway. And so Norway had Christian influence before. Olaf goes around just smashing idols and temples and burning places of pagan worship. So he gets rid of it. Before, like, his grandfathers had introduced Christianity, it was sort of an option. You could do either or, and Olaf just gets rid of it all. And then he starts sending missionaries to Iceland, and they're somewhat successful. And in Iceland they had a republic, and they had a assembly of chiefs that made decisions. And at one of the assemblies, the Thorgeir at the time was what they called a law speaker, and he said, "You can't have two gods here," because you have to remember their pagan idolatry controlled their civil governing. So they couldn't be governed in a pagan sense and a Christian sense. They had to pick one or the other. And Thorgeir he's the lawgiver, the law speaker in Iceland. And he is presented with this conundrum, and so he goes and sits in his hut with a cloth over his face for 3 days, and he comes back to the assembly and says, "We're going to worship Christ. We're going to worship God in three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and his law is the one we're going to conform to." And it was interesting to see. It seems at first glance that is a very forceful method of converting a huge group of people, but when you look at the fruit of it, a whole bunch of Icelanders actually took their idols and went to a specific cliff, and all together they decided, we're going to embrace this Christian faith, and they took their idols and threw them over the cliff. So it's both and. I don't think we can say from history that every individual in that assembly was converted, but you can see a massive work of God in converting many hearts and transforming a culture. So by 1000 AD, Christianity had spread over much of Europe. I want to show you these maps really quick. You can see a direct correlation between the Viking raids from Scandinavia through Europe and the spread of the gospel. And it's pretty breathtaking to see how quickly this all happened. So when the Vikings converted to Christianity and started sending out missionaries, all of Europe was fairly quickly converted. Because the Vikings had been so thorough in their plundering and trade routes, these same roads were very effective in spreading the gospel. So we have Russia, we got Vladimir, he's Christian, Boleslav the Brave in Poland, King Stephen the Saint, Robert the Pious is in France, Harald Bluetooth converts Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason converts Norway, Britain was already converted, we have Leif up in Greenland, Sancho the Great, King of Navarre. The whole of Europe is pretty much converted really quickly to Christianity at this point. So I think it's pretty profound to realize that while they were busying themselves with infrastructure to satisfy their temporal greed and avarice, God was laying the groundwork for his mission work. And what they meant for evil, God used for good to redeem countless men and women out of darkness into light.